Hello, everyone. I'm Judy Taranchuk. I'm representing today both the Graduate and Faculty Christian Forum and the Canadian Scientific and Christian Affiliation. The CSCA, Canadian Scientific and Christian Affiliation, is a Canada-wide organization of academic and applied scientists and others interested in the integration of science and Christian faith. You can find out more about CSCA on our website, very simple, csca.ca. I want to mention right now that CSCA is having an online winter symposium Saturday, January 25th, with watch parties across Canada. The title of the symposium is AI and Christianity. The speakers will be Rosalind Picard of MIT and AI technologist Joanna Ng, both of whom have been featured CSCA speakers in the past. Oh, can I just mention here that for those joining in that you mute your microphones as you join so that we don't have a lot of extraneous noise. Thank you so much for doing that, muting your microphones. This watch party there'll be a watch party for the winter symposium of the CSCA, and it will be on the UBC campus. There'll be many watch parties across Canada, but the one on the UBC campus will be sponsored by the Vancouver chapter of CSCA, as well as the Society of Catholic Scientists. And this watch party will include a lunch and a local panel of people from the Society of Catholic Scientists and others. You can see the website at csca.ca for details. CSCA has had a decades-long relationship with both the American Scientific Affiliation in the US, as well as Christians in Science in the UK, as well as the Faraday Institute at Cambridge University, which was founded by today's featured speaker, Dennis Alexander. Now, I've known Dennis for several years. I think we first met at a CIS conference in the UK, and I think it was sometime in the 90s, but I'm not really sure anymore. Dennis has spent 40 years in the biomedical research community. He's an emeritus fellow of St. Edmund's College, Cambridge, and he founded the Faraday Institute for the Study of Science and Religion at Cambridge in 2006. He spent 15 years in the Middle East, something which I think is very interesting at the moment. He set up a neurochemistry lab in Ankara, Turkey, and from 1981 to 1986, he was at the American University of Beirut and helped found a new research lab in human genetics there, and also the first prenatal diagnostic unit in the Arab world. He and his family were evacuated 3 times from Beirut during the conflicts there, including the Israeli bombing of Beirut in 1982. He then, on returning to the UK, became leader at the Bobraham Institute at Cambridge, where he worked on lymphocyte signaling and oncology. Dennis has been writing on science and religion since 1972, when he was only in his 20s, and he was editor of the journal Science and Christian Belief, the journal of CIS in the UK, and he gave the Gifford Lectures at St. Andrews in 2012. His recent books include many books, but the recent ones include Is There Purpose in Biology, published in 2018, Are We Slaves to Our Genes, published in 2020, and the one that we will be talking about today, Coming to Faith Through Dawkins, which was co-edited with Alistair McGrath. and will be the topic of our discussion today. Can I remind you all who are coming in to mute your microphone so that we don't have a lot of extraneous noise? Thank you so much. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dennis Alexander.
我这样吧，我跟你做个交易，我又备菜又做饭，你把这边全部收拾干净。什么意思啊？把碗洗了，然后把垃圾都倒了。可以啊，可以吧 ？OK。
Please mute your microphones.
就是我就把所有的整理干净，把所有垃圾全扔，对，把所有厨房全部在里面，什么都做了。对。
Please, everyone, mute your microphones, except for Dennis. Okay.
Okay, I think we have some quiet now. Thank you very much. And can I just start by thanking the organizers together muted us. I won't be able to talk, I'm afraid. So do you have any contact with the gentleman there? You could maybe speak. I don't know if you can do it. Let's see. Actually, do you know what? I've just muted him. That's right, because I am now, you know what? I'm the, whatever it's called, the organizer on this course. So I've just muted him. I hope you don't mind. There we go. Yeah, so thank you very much indeed for this opportunity to share a few thoughts on this topic. I hope my voice is loud enough for you. And I guess if you wave an arm at the organizers, if my voice is dropping or you can't hear, just please let me know. And I hope everyone can see the screen, always worth checking. So again, please just wave an arm at the organizers if that's any problem. It was great to hear that you have some sunshine in Vancouver. I wish we had some sunshine here in Cambridge, UK, but we do not. And we haven't had it for a very long time. I'm actually looking forward to coming to Vancouver next May to do some teaching at Regent College. I'm afraid for the moment, my digital presence is all you have. So there we go. And we'll move on from there. Now, let me just also say by way of introduction that although the name of Richard Dawkins is in the title of this talk, in no way should this talk be interpreted as some kind of personal attack upon the good professor. And he remains a great popularizer of science. And as a fellow evolutionary biologist, I often recommend his books to others, in particular, the one shown on the screen there, The Ancestor's Tale, which I think really represents a great way of explaining evolutionary history to those less familiar with this wonderful field of inquiry. I also realize there may be some listening today who don't really know who Richard Dawkins is, so let me provide a brief bio. Well, he was born in Nairobi in Kenya in 1941 while it was still under British colonial rule, and his father was a civil servant. The family returned to the UK in 1949 when Richard was aged 8. He had a normal Anglican church upbringing. The Anglican Church, otherwise known as the Church of England, is a state church and has long been involved in education in the UK at all levels. For the Dawkins family, being Anglicans probably meant going to church at Easter and Christmas and becoming familiar with the well-known Anglican hymns. In fact, Richard's parents sent him to Oundle School, which is a large private boarding school not far from Cambridge. And the English language is really confusing because we call, as you probably know, we call that type of school a public school, meaning it's a private school. I mean, language is so rational. And like most public schools in the UK, it's an Anglican school, which in Dawkins' day involved compulsory chapel services. And that's still the case on Sundays at least. As I know, because I was invited to preach there on a Sunday morning a few years ago, Dawkins was actually midway through his teenage years whilst at Oundle when he decided to give up whatever Christian faith he may have had, which I suspect wasn't a whole lot, and he became an atheist. And so Dawkins himself writes about that experience at school. He writes, the main residual reason why I was religious was from being so impressed with the complexity of life and feeling that it had to have a designer. And I think it was when I realized that Darwinism was a far superior explanation that pulled the rug out from under the argument of design, and that left me with nothing. But despite this, Dawkins has always called himself a cultural Christian, and especially so, I think, during the past year or so in articles that have aroused significant medium comment. Last Easter, he was interviewed on LBC radio station, that's London Broadcasting Company, a popular commercial radio station, and was very clear in identifying himself as a cultural Christian, saying, and I quote, "I love hymns and Christmas carols." Also, he said, "I'm on Team Christian," and also that Christianity is a fundamentally decent religion. But it's quite clear, as he listened to the interview, that one of the main reasons that Dawkins wants the UK to continue to be culturally Christian is to act as a bulwark against Islam. And during the interview, Dawkins repeated several times that he continues to think that actual Christian beliefs, like the resurrection of Christ, are complete nonsense. But let's return to his bio for a moment. Dawkins did his undergraduate degree and DPhil in zoology at Oxford. DPhils are what Oxford people call their PhDs. My time at Oxford studying biochemistry for 4 years in the mid-1960s actually overlapped with Dawkins, but I never knew him because then he was already doing his DPhil research on the pecking behavior of chicks. So he was a graduate when I was there as an undergraduate. And really, Dawkins was pretty much unknown as a zoologist until he started writing his popular and best-selling books on evolutionary biology. His time at Oundle was not wasted. They taught him how to write, and he writes really well. And then in 1995, he became professor of the public understanding of science at Oxford, which also increased his public profile. I can well remember reading his first book, The Selfish Gene, round the pool in West Beirut, Lebanon. Yes, we did have a pool there, when I was working in the American University Hospital in the early 1980s. And I was just thinking at that time, what a great book it was. As I was saying, he's just so very good at explaining evolutionary biology for a general readership. Having said that, I think Dawkins now rather regrets popularizing the phrase selfish gene, as we now know so well from genomics that genes are great cooperators. If they didn't function together in a cooperative way, then nothing would be alive, including, of course, ourselves. But given all his best-selling books on science, I think it was a real shock and surprise to many people when Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, came out in 2006, because it was so passionate and vindictive. It was quite unlike the popular science books that he had been writing up until then. Basically, in this book, Dawkins is campaigning with lots of rhetoric, but very little rational argument for people to become atheists like himself. So we might ask, why this sudden anti-religious passion? I don't think anyone doubts that 9/11 was the real trigger for what came to be called the New Atheist Movement. Richard Dawkins had been arguing for years that religion was irrational and dangerous without making much headway. Suddenly, his arguments seemed both attractive and culturally plausible to many in Western cultures. Someone, something had to be blamed for 9/11. So let's blame religion. In the introduction to the book, Coming to Faith Through Dawkins, Professor Alistair McGrath from Oxford provides a fine historical analysis of the cultural movement that came to be known as the New Atheism, and also the reasons for its decline. So you can read more about his comments there. But let me just quote also from one secular commentator on that particular point. This is Konstantin Kisin, the Russian-born satirist, author, and political commentator who commented on the so-called New Atheism recently in these words, and I quote, "The reason New Atheism has lost its mojo is that it has no answers to the lack of meaning and purpose that our post-Christian societies are suffering from. What will fill that void? Religious people have their answer, do the rest of us," close quote. And in a way, this new book, Coming to Faith Through Dawkins, which came out last year, published by Craigle, addresses precisely that question. It's a book of 12 essays written by 12 different authors coming from 5 different countries: Australia, South Africa, Egypt, the United Kingdom, and the USA. The authors are all very different with a wide range of cultural backgrounds. I'd actually only met one of them when the book was published, but I've met several of them since that time at book launches in places like London, Cairo, and then Pretoria in South Africa. But they all do have one thing in common. They used to be atheists or agnostics, but the writings of the new atheists, such as Richard Dawkins or the late Christopher Hitchens, played an important role in their varied pathways to Christian faith. And I like to say that, in a way, it was a book that wrote itself. As co-editors, Alistair McGrath and I both knew of Professor Andrew Goslar from Oxford, who was once a lecturer in zoology in the same department as Professor Dawkins. And Professor Goslar, an atheist from a Jewish background, had already written up a brief account some years ago about how his secular upbringing and mindset was turned in the direction of belief in God and Christian faith as a result of being exposed to the thinking of Richard Dawkins. And I have to confess that I just thought that this was an unusual and perhaps unique pathway to faith, and it was very unlikely that other atheists might have discovered Christian faith in this way. Well, how wrong I was. Both Alistair McGrath and I, who co-edited this book together, we kept bumping into other Christians in different parts of the world at conferences and perhaps after lectures, who had also been turned from atheism or agnosticism to faith in Christ as a result of the thinking and publications of the new atheists. I mean, it wasn't that we weren't going round asking people how they become Christians. It was more a case that in casual conversation, these stories could emerge as we talked in general about the relationship between science and faith. And so after a bit, we just started thinking, these stories are really fascinating. They deserve a public airing. And even if you're not, even if you're just a sociologist of religion, for example, the stories certainly have academic interest. But I think more than that, these are deeply personal stories, in many cases, narratives about people's lives in which their lives have been changed and taken on a whole new direction. So let's publish them, we thought, and so we did. And in terms of background, we have in the book scientists, we have a historian, we have authors from artistic and journalistic backgrounds, we have a scholar working on the philosophy of Nietzsche, we have a recent graduate in philosophy and political science from the American University of Cairo, and others besides. So really the authors are a real mix, which I rather like. I'm often asked whether there are any common themes running through this volume of essays. Are there any particular reasons why these authors found the new atheist narrative problematic? And what turned them away from those narratives to explore Christian faith? I'd like to mention just 3 themes here, and then after that, I'll tell some of the authors' stories, or at least pick out bits of their stories, just to illustrate the 3 main themes shown here. First, some found that there was a kind of yawning gap between atheistic philosophy and Western humanistic morality. Secondly, most of them found one or more of the new atheist arguments to be weak or irrational. Thirdly, several of the authors in particular found a significant ugliness in both the style and content of the new atheist arguments, whereas what they were really looking for was precisely the opposite. They were looking for a combination of beauty and truth. So, to illustrate that first theme, let me just tell you about one of our essay writers, Dr. Sarah Irving Steinbrecher, who comes from Sydney, Australia. And I was thinking that since we're all online for this particular talk, so I think your screen will be close up, I'm going to let our various authors speak in their own words. So I hope you don't mind some fairly lengthy quotes, simply because I think it's easier for them to tell their own stories. So let's listen to Professor Irving Steinbrecher. She writes, I grew up in Sydney, Australia, in a loving non-Christian home with parents who loved each other and their children dearly. My family took seriously the engagement with truth and ideas. My father was a renowned scholar of Australian labour history and professor of government at the University of Sydney. Family mealtimes were often a forum for discussing history, politics, and issues of social justice. My parents always encouraged me to learn and to pursue the truth. And she describes how, as a teenager, and again I quote, I believed that I did not need a God to tell me who I was or how to make sense of the world. I knew what my life was all about. Surely Christianity was just a crutch. I didn't need it. Close quote. But then Sarah came here to Cambridge to do a PhD in history and philosophy of science. It was one of the happiest moments in her life to travel thousands of miles from home to do research in a top university. But in her research, she was suddenly exposed to the fact that virtually all of the key founders of modern science were theists and often Christians. Just going to try and mute. Sorry, I'm going to try and mute the off. Okay. And so she discovered that virtually all these key founders of modern science were theists and often committed Christians, and this began to shake a kind of I'm just going to pause for a second and see if I can.
अभी बहुत बीच का अपॉइंटमेंट थे 11 बजे 11 बजे उठी और रिस्केड्यूल करा करते रहती यहाँ तो कल 1 बजे हो जाओ कल शिफ्ट है मेरी या तो फिर नेक्स्ट ट्यूसडे करेंगे शिफ्ट मैं कहा चलो ठीक है मेरे को स्केड्यूल मिला नहीं बट ओके
I would be grateful of those listening if you could mute your mic. That would be really helpful, just so we can carry on here. Hopefully you can mute. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Okay, so as I was saying, Sarah was here in Cambridge and discovering that all of these natural philosophers, these early scientists that she was beginning to learn about more as part of her PhD were actually theists or they were Christians. And this sort of began to undermine really her default kind of atheism. Sorry, now we've lost in the process of doing that, we have lost, I think, the screen. So I will have to pause, sorry about this, and just see if I can get that back again. Okay. Right. Interesting. Okay, sorry about that. I think we have the screen back again there. So what happened next was that after her PhD in Cambridge, go to full screen again. Sorry about that. Hopefully that's okay. So after her PhD in Cambridge, Sarah became a junior research fellow in Oxford. And it was whilst there she went to hear the well-known, nope, sorry, I'm not on slideshow. Slight problem here. I'm going to have to somehow, we have got a problem. I'm going to have to come out of it and go back in again. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again, just so you know what's going on there. And we'll see if that works. Right. Okay. I think that's going to work. Let me see if I go back one. Right. Okay. So we've arrived at with Sarah, and she's become a junior research fellow at Oxford. And it was while she was there that she went to hear the well-known philosopher and fellow Australian Peter Singer give a series of lectures. As you might know, the philosopher Peter Singer, his utilitarian ethics are very much founded on his atheism. So again, let's pick up Sarah's story in her own words. And I quote, Singer was thoughtful and calm, and droll, yet quick-witted. Here we go. Singer was thoughtful and calm, droll yet quick-witted, and I remember feeling very proud to hear his Australian accent in the lecture hall at Oxford. And he had an impressive intellectual honesty. With logical consistency, Singer pursued the implications of atheism for ethics, even when they lead to uncomfortable positions. Indeed, I left Singer's lectures with a profound intellectual vertigo. I was compelled to confront one of my most deeply held beliefs. And then Sarah goes on to say that I had always believed in the innate equality of all people, black or white, able-bodied or disabled, sick or healthy, young or old. I assumed this was something that all reasonable people agreed upon, and that it was entirely consistent with my atheism. One of Singer's foundational claims, however, is that the innate preciousness and equal value of human beings is a Christian myth. Moreover, the sanctity of human life is a principle that cannot be rationally defended, precisely because it depends upon Christian underpinnings. In reality, Singer argues, humans are nothing more than a higher form of primate. This has enormous ethical consequences. As he explains it, the belief that mere membership in our species, irrespective of other characteristics, makes a great difference to the wrongness of killing a being is a legacy of a religious doctrine, close quote. And so, for the first time in her life, Sarah began to face up to the inexorable logic of the atheist position. And I again quote here from Sarah, quote, the biological reality of human life is hierarchical, not egalitarian. Indeed, as Dawkins puts it so memorably in River Out of Eden, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. If this biological reality is ultimate, which is the case if there is no God, then it is absurd and entirely inconsistent with atheism to suddenly believe that the life of the weakest human is as valuable as the life of the fittest and strongest. What a delusion. And it was, in fact, not then in Oxford that Sarah finally became a Christian. That happened a little later after she took up an academic position in the States. And it followed a long search through the Bible and through the writings of authors such as C.S. Lewis. But it was really the yawning gap between atheistic philosophy and its failure to provide a rational basis for a coherent morality that shook her atheistic foundations to the core and finally set her on the road to Christian faith. In this context, I think it's interesting to see how much the yawning gap is still apparent in the thinking of Richard Dawkins right up to the present day. I was just watching a few days ago a film discussion between Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins, which happened a couple of weeks ago. Whatever you might think of Jordan Peterson, he is a robust debater, and I think really put Dawkins on the spot when he asked Dawkins his adherence to a Christian humanist morality. Basically, at the same time, he believes in a universe in which there is no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Perhaps not surprisingly, Dawkins had no clear answer to that question. In fact, I don't know how it is more generally in Canada, but here in the UK over the past few years, there's been quite a number of public intellectuals who have publicized their return to at least a form of cultural Christianity, and in some cases to an active Christian faith. And one of the motivations for their change in direction is simply the one spelt out so clearly by Sarah Irving Stonebreaker, that if you give up on the Christian underpinnings of the moral fabric that holds societies together and which provides such a strong moral underpinning for values such as egalitarianism, then such values are very likely to fade away with the passing of time. A striking example of this trend is provided by the popular British historian Tom Holland, shown on the screen here. His magisterial book, Dominion, published a few years ago, maps out the history of the church since its beginning, warts and all, recording how the utterly strange life and death of Jesus, the man for others, provided a stark contrast to the brutal repression of the Roman Empire, so that still even today, as Holland writes, to live in a Western country is to live in a society still utterly saturated by Christian concepts and assumptions. Holland wishes to apply this equally to those who are either secular or Christian, even labeling Richard Dawkins as a Christian, in inverted commas, in the sense that his assumptions, his freedom of expression, and the values he holds so closely would not exist were it not for this saturation. Holland himself is on his own spiritual journey, and what has turned him away from his atheism are precisely the kinds of concerns that Sarah Irving Breaker spelt out so clearly for us in her essay. The move towards Christian faith by several other public figures here in the UK has recently been mapped out by broadcaster, writer, and speaker Justin Brierley in his book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And I recommend that book if you're interested in finding out more about these recent cultural and religious trends. But now, let's move to the second main theme in the book of essays, Coming to Faith Through Dawkins, and that is that several of the authors simply found the arguments of new atheist writers such as Dawkins weak and unpersuasive. And I want to provide here just a couple of examples. Peter Barham from here in England had a very different background to Sarah Irving Stonebreaker. Peter grew up loving art, films and acting. He studied theatre and drama at university, later acting in Shakespeare plays. It was whilst he was at university that he also became interested in analytical philosophy and became a strongly committed atheist, in the process rejecting the last dying remnants of his Christian upbringing. Peter writes, and I quote, "I remember the moment vividly. It was a cold evening, walking with a group of fellow students along the outskirts of Canterbury, probably between pubs, and I overheard my friend say, 'You've got to read this new book called The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. It's amazing.' My friend had seen the light." As Peter writes, he was convinced by Dawkins' assertion, and I quote, "Faith means believing in something without any evidence." Dawkins contrasted this with the virtues of pursuing truth, always having reasons for what you believe, and being ready to change your beliefs when presented with superior evidence. Close quote. He also learned from Dawkins that science can account for everything. In fact, Peter became a serious disciple of Richard Dawkins, following him around the country to hear his lectures, listening to his podcasts, and all that kind of thing. But then, as he describes it, he made the mistake of starting to watch YouTube debates between atheists and Christians, and became disturbed by the fact that often the Christians seemed to have the best answers. One day he watched a film debate between the atheist chemist Professor Peter Atkins from Oxford and the American Christian philosopher William Lane Craig. Professor Atkins is well known for his scientism, the belief shared with Dawkins that science can account for everything. But then, writes Peter Barham, the Christian, that is William Lane Craig, in this debate proceeded to rattle off a list of 5 things that science cannot prove, yet belief in them is still entirely rational. He listed them here in his essay. 1, logical and mathematical truths. Science presupposes them, so it would be arguing in a circle to use science to prove them. 2, metaphysical truths, e.g., there are minds other than my own, or the external world is real, or the past wasn't created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. 3, moral truths. Science is descriptive, but not prescriptive. For example, science will tell you that if you want to kill your grandmother, you should put arsenic in her drink, but science cannot tell you whether it is right or wrong to kill her in the first place. 4, aesthetic truths. The beautiful, like the good, also cannot be scientifically proven. 5, science itself Not only is science permeated with unprovable assumptions, but the statement you should only believe what can be scientifically proven is itself not provable by science. As Peter remarks as he listened to those points, the weird thing was that despite Dawkins and his fellow new atheists' insistence that atheism was the superior rational view, it was this Christian academic who was leading the way and setting an example for how such logical argumentation ought to be conducted. So as Peter followed Dawkins around, he tried to persuade him to debate William Lane Craig, the philosopher, but Dawkins repeatedly declined the offer, maybe remembering what had happened to Christopher Hitchens, shown here, when he had debated Craig in 2009, an event that many atheists found embarrassing, as Hitchens had let their side down so badly. For Peter Barham, this was yet another sign that the new atheists were in a weaker intellectual position, and became increasingly disillusioned with Dawkins, as he found that the arguments of the God delusion could readily be picked apart using the tools of analytical philosophy. Not only that, but Peter Barham then started discovering that there was plenty of good rational evidence for Christian faith, and another of Dawkins' assertions about faith involving believing without any evidence began to be eroded. Eventually, after a lengthy search, Peter became a Christian and was baptized in 2012. It's therefore quite interesting to read here on the screen his concluding comments and his thank yous at the end of his essay. He writes, in summary, despite the criticism I have been directing at Dawkins throughout this story, I ultimately do need to thank him. Dawkins stirred up a massively important conversation which otherwise might have lain dormant. The arguments and challenges in the God delusion have stress tested how seriously people take their views on God, how well thought through such views are, and whether their proponents even believe them in the first place. He wouldn't like me saying this, Peter goes on to write, but Dawkins put me on the road to Christian faith, which is not belief without evidence, but placing your trust in what the evidence shows you. He shook me out of my apathy and insisted that I follow the evidence where it led. The only twist was, the evidence took me where he didn't want it to go, nor I initially, and it transpired that his atheism was not as airtight as he claimed. Now, still on the subject of the weakness of Dawkins-style arguments for atheism, I'd just like to mention another of our authors, this time from South Africa, and that's Dr. Louise Mabille. As I was mentioning earlier, Louise is a Nietzsche scholar holding a PhD on Nietzsche's theory of justice and a second PhD in English on John Milton's Parrhesia, an examination of the Protestant tradition of speaking truth to power. I met her for the first time when I was down in Pretoria last year. She was raised in a completely secular family, which is quite unusual for Africa. Her essay is entitled The God Delusion and Probability. Louise, as I found when I met her down in South Africa last year, she's quite a polymath, and in her interesting essay describes how she encountered the God delusion when she was already a university lecturer in philosophy. As she comments, and I quote, "What bothered me most about the God delusion and what contributed most to my eventual turn to Christianity was that it made enormous claims upon which it then failed to deliver. What is more, it was delivered in such a condescending and negative tone that one is forced to reconsider the validity of all this rage. It just could not form a whole coherent worldview. I am by nature a very inquisitive person, and contrary to Dawkins' assertion that believers do not submit their worldviews to critical analysis, I think most of us do. It certainly means that Dawkins' own thoughts should also be carefully scrutinized." Close quote. The particular claim that Louise scrutinizes in her essay is a claim by Dawkins that, quote, "a God capable of creating the universe would have to be so complex as to be statistically improbable." Close quote. She patiently dissects this claim from both philosophical and mathematical perspectives. Time is really too short to give full justice to her arguments, but her essay finishes with these words. We hope that you have not grown too attached to the easy answers science purports to give, for every answer encloses a further mystery within it. I believe the mystery can only ultimately be solved by turning to the original mystery writer. Close quote. I suppose it's worth adding that this comment, as Louise makes quite clear in her essay, is not in any way intended to be a critique of the science itself, but rather a commentary on the scientism that so often characterizes Dawkins' statements. So let's go now to the third general theme that runs through several of the essays in Coming to Faith through Dawkins, and that is the significant ugliness in both the style and content of the New Atheist arguments that did work to turn some of our authors away from their atheism. Let me give just a couple of examples. I mentioned Professor Andy Gosler earlier on. He's professor of ethno-ornithology at the University of Oxford. And if you're wondering what that is, it means the study of how indigenous peoples in different parts of the world are involved in the creation and care of their particular environments. Andrew teaches courses in ecology, evolution, ethnobiology, and conservation, and is research director of the Ethno-Ornithology World Atlas Project, co-founded with BirdLife International. In his previously published account as to how he turned from atheism to Christian faith, Andrew describes how he was a lecturer in zoology in the same department as Richard Dawkins in Oxford, and was fully convinced at that time of Dawkins' arguments for atheism. But then one day he was listening to a departmental seminar by Richard Dawkins, and as a throwaway comment, Dawkins remarked that, and I quote, "Of course we know that there are no serious academic scientists who are Christians." And Andrew just sat there thinking, well, wait a minute, that's not true. I know quite a few. And indeed he's right. Oxford, like Cambridge, has plenty of scientists who are Christians. And that acted as a small trigger that began to shake his faith in his colleague. If Dawkins could be so wrong in making that statement about such a simple thing, then maybe he might be wrong also about some of the other claims that he was making. Now, in his essay in Coming to Faith through Dawkins, which is entitled Hearing God Through an Enchantment with Nature, Andrew goes on to explain that there was much more going on in his shift from atheism to Christ, and it was all tied up with his own research on bird behavior. A bird called honeyguide played a key role in his spiritual journey, as it has a unique relationship to humans and was, according to Andrew, involved in our own co-evolution. As Andrew writes, the name honeyguide gives the clue to our relationship, for the greater honeyguide uniquely guides humans to the nests of wild bees. His extensive ecological studies led him to write this in his essay. Gradually, I came to associate or identify my sense of dis-ease with the writings of Richard Dawkins. For me, finding healing and making my peace with these realities was profoundly bound up with coming to faith, whilst rejecting the atheist rhetoric that had come to pervade the literature of evolution after Dawkins. To be more specific, I became more sensitive to the association between the degradation of life on Earth, extinction of species and cultures, and the lost awareness of the sacramental nature of life, the effects of which are plain to see pervading our own post-imperialist cultures. Then Andrew continues, furthermore, as a scientist, I came to reject Dawkins' strident, unquestioning belief, unwavering even in the face of contrary evidence, that only the peculiarly masculinist neo-Darwinian framing of evolution could possibly yield adaptive change in living organisms over time. This was the same neo-Darwinism that spawned eugenics and thence the Holocaust, a post-Darwinian legacy that left deep scars across my own family in the Netherlands from 1942 onwards. For a young naturalist involving a career path out of a love of nature in general and birds in particular, there was a deep hurt in being told by a distinguished academic through the authority of a book that while it's unfortunate if you find these truths distasteful, that's the way of the world, so grow up and deal with it, close quote. So it was really stark contrast that Andrew found between the beauty and harmony of nature when compared to Dawkins' particular gloss on the evolutionary process, selfish genes and so forth, that alienated him from atheism and led him eventually to Christian faith. Today, as well as being professor of ethno-ornithology in Oxford, he is also a Third Order Franciscan and an ordained minister in the Church of England. It's been quite a long journey from his earlier atheism. For our second example of how some of our authors were driven away from the new atheism by its lack of beauty, I'd like to introduce you to the final chapter in the volume of essays written by Ashley Land, writer and artist. I've never met Ashley, but when I read the essays by Professor Andy Gosler and Ashley Land side by side, their very different upbringings do remind me somewhat of chalk and cheese. Ashley grew up as an American Californian cultural hippie. A great hero was the late Christopher Hitchens, a significant figure in the New Atheist movement. As she writes, and I quote, "I was 23 when Hitchens' book God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything was published. It would be the last Hitchens book I ever read. I'd graduated from college a year earlier and began working as a reporter at a local newspaper. And my commitment to atheism had only intensified with time and experience. I'd spent most of my college years partying, and although hedonism nearly destroyed me, with all the arrogant vigor of youth, I was determined never to take refuge in what I'd long decided was a lie. I needed to codify my atheism, I believed. I began poring over the works of Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. But Hitch was the one, glorious in his polemical savagery, winsome in his trenchant bon mot. This book became a kind of idol to me. And later, Ashley then spent years experimenting with psychedelic drugs, magic mushrooms, and then LSD, because she had this great longing for beauty and truth. And only after 6 years of that, after many hesitations, did she finally take the first step towards Christian faith, physically chucking all the idols out of her house in the process. She certainly didn't find the combination of beauty and truth in psychedelic drugs, though she sometimes did have experience of great beauty, but they were never linked to truth. They were fantasies. So, there we have it, coming to faith through Dawkins. I hope these brief overviews of some of our authors have at least whetted your appetite to buy the book and read more. We sell it from our online shop at the Faraday Institute here in Cambridge for £10. I'm not sure how much the postage and package to Canada might work out, but anyway, if you're shopping around, it might turn out to be the cheapest. I don't know. Just to finish on a more personal note, I have to confess that as a Christian, when I read Dawkins' God Delusion for the first time, I just felt that I was an atheist like Dawkins, because I really don't believe in the God that he doesn't believe in, at least as portrayed in this particular book. And I suppose we are all atheists with respect to some concept of God or other. Something to think about. Now I take this opportunity as we close to warmly invite you to our next Faraday Institute summer course, taking place next summer, 30th of June to 4th of July. It's going to take place under the title Science, Religion and Justice. It will be a hybrid course, so available online, but Cambridge is a lovely place to visit in early July. Not right now, I don't recommend it in November, but July is lovely, so please do come and see us. And as I was mentioning earlier, I'm looking forward to teaching at Regent College at their summer school, May 26 to 30 next year, with 4 lectures per day on the theme of current issues in science and religion. So please do pass the word around to students especially who might be interested in hearing more about this topic. Now, thank you for your attention, and it's over to you for questions and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you very much for your very helpful overview of the issues at play in this discussion. And so at this point, I think we'd like to open it up for questions. Judy was going to ask the first question, and then if you could please put your hand up as per the mechanism on Zoom. we'll recognize your question. Judy.
Thank you so much for that talk, Dennis. That was really very, very engaging. It seems to me that Dawkins, in his book, is dealing with a very constricted view of religion, and in many ways an American fundamentalist view and not a wider view of religion. I was particularly in the book taken by Anniko Albert's chapter, where she talks about her surprise when she first moved from Marxist Hungary, Marxist and atheist Hungary, to the United States and began to interact with some atheists there. And she was surprised at their naive views about Christianity. And just a little bit here, she says, our textbooks have been written by Marxists after all, and they were very clear that wars were ultimately fought over control of resources, with religious or other justifications invented as needed. And she talks about this asymmetrical epistemological razor that seems to pervade Dawkins' views, that you have to prove all the good things about atheism and all the bad things, wars and other, things that come from religion. Would you like to comment on this?
Thank you. Yes, that's an interesting comment. I mean, certainly quite a number of my atheist friends, and I'm thinking especially of people like the late Michael Ruse, the philosopher, American philosopher who sadly died only a few weeks ago, who's a good friend and who often came to Cambridge and we had good interactions together. I mean, people like that are much more serious about their atheism, I would say. They're much better read and willing to discuss and to listen to arguments. And I know Michael Ruse, when he read The God Illusion, he just found that was very embarrassing for his own atheistic views. And I think a number of more academic atheists have distanced themselves from people like, Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens, precisely for that reason, that they just found it a very rather extreme and badly presented presentation of their atheism. I think it's quite interesting, in fact. I mean, as far as this country is concerned, I don't know about Canada, but the new atheism is really a historical movement now. You don't really hear about it now in this country. It came to its sort of peak around, I suppose, the years 2006, 2009, thereabouts, and then it's sort of gradually been declining really over the years. And I think one of the reasons, there's several reasons for that, I think. But I think one of the reasons was that it just failed to obtain any real grip in the universities in terms of people taking it seriously. So, and something, I know some of my science colleagues, would think, Richard Dawkins is somehow embarrassing for the scientific community because one of the things we don't like in this country is extremism of any kind. And it just sounded very extreme. And maybe that's a very British cultural thing, but we don't like people not listening to others, and we don't like this sort of vindictive, rhetorical type of presentation that is not really academic in nature. And I think all of that sort of helped to speed up the decline. There's also, you mentioned one essayist, there's another one I didn't quote from, Simon, who's in the first chapter there, who was an American communist, a very rare species, I think, probably an American communist, but again, he was a keen atheist, and but he actually came to Christian faith really triggered partly through reading of the New Atheists and so on, but it was more, in fact, through his science, interestingly, and he was studying quantum mechanics, but that's another story anyway. So as I was saying, the stories are very different between the essays, which I rather like. I like that diversity.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Are there other questions? While you're thinking about that, I had a question from the chapter by Louise Maybill, and there was an interesting way in which Dawkins integrated the improbability of the evolution of life, or certain improbabilities in evolution, into his probabilities, and sort of working interesting logic. So it was a question of the statistics at work in probability theory. And do you remember that particular chapter?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah,
Yes.
good.
Yes, it is an interesting chapter, and I'm not a mathematician, and I was just looking on the screen to see if Professor Martin Barlow may be with us. But anyway, I wanted to show that chapter actually to Professor Martin Barlow, who used to be in Vancouver, who's now living in Cambridge, and I see him every other week or so. And it would be interesting, as someone who's a real specialist in probability theory within mathematics, to see what his particular views were on that chapter. But Louise's main point, in a sense, is talking about the probability of a universe like ours is very tricky. Is a tricky type of question mathematically, because we know it exists and we know we're here. So probability is one. So that's so talking about probabilities of things that have already happened, it gets to be a rather difficult argument. But I'm not a specialist in that particular field, and there may be people on the screen who are specialists in probability theory, and you could read Louise's chapter and see what you think of our argument. But certainly it was that was one of the reasons that really undermined enthusiasm, or earlier enthusiasm, for the new atheists, or particularly Dawkins type of arguments about the probability of the universe and so on. Yeah. It's a big topic. I don't say I'm a specialist in that area, but I found it a very interesting chapter. Just when I'm mentioning Louise, let me also mention that I found it very interesting that 3 of our writers are all from South Africa, again, coming from very different backgrounds. And it was a great privilege to meet all 3 of them, in fact, in Pretoria at the end of last year. I think it was sometime, when was it? December, I think I was, no, November. And we did a book launch, and I got them all up front to just present themselves and so on. And funny enough, we met in an unusual church, which in the Pretoria Rugby Club. If you know anything about South Africa, you'll know that rugby is basically the main religion of Africa, South Africa. Okay, so anyway, it was an interesting place to do the book launch there, but very interesting to meet Louise. Thank you.
I see at least one other scientist who has studied at Cambridge, Olaf, and I just wondered if he had a question. Olaf Sleemaker. Oh, you have to unmute yourself, Olaf. Oh, sorry.
Something I should have learned by now.
There you go. You're live.
I greatly appreciate the presentation. It's fascinating to me that Dennis is relegating the Dawkins delusion to past history. Here in Vancouver, I find it's extremely relevant and continues to confuse the world very strongly. So the arguments presented in this book are really appreciated and helpful, even though we may be 10 years behind the advanced thinking that Dennis represents. But my thanks to you, Dennis.
Okay.
Thank
Other
you.
question? There's a question. Yes, go ahead. I don't know your name. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I wanted to address Dawkins' definition of faith, and then give my perspective on a definition of faith, and ask if that would be how you would see it as well. So Dawkins essentially defines faith as believing something without evidence, and I don't think that's unique to him. I think a lot of atheists and agnostics and skeptics put forward such a definition of faith, and Of course, that's an easy one to shoot down. I wouldn't want to subscribe to that definition of faith either. My perspective is that has never been a true definition of faith in the Christian circles. There may be some Christians who have said things like that, but I think they don't represent what real Christian faith is. I think real Christian faith is weighing the evidence and deciding to believe what is more likely, that this is more likely than that. It might not, the evidence might not absolutely prove the conclusion, so there's still something of a leap to take, but you're taking a leap in the most likely direction. Could you comment on whether that would be how you would see things in terms of, not just in terms of your own definition of faith, but what you think has been the definition of faith within Christendom?
Yes, I think as you look back, if you look at the New Testament, if you look at church history, there's always been a central place played for belief and evidence, and it's been defined and understood in different ways, I think, in different eras of church history. I always find it fascinating that if you go back to Apostle Paul's discussion of the resurrection in Corinthians, in his letter to the Corinthians, and when he's talking about the resurrection of Christ, but basically he says, you know, the bottom line of the argument there, I find really fascinating, because it's almost like, it's really like a falsifiability argument, because of course in his day, as he was writing to the church in Corinth, anybody, if the body of Jesus was still lying there in some tomb in Jerusalem, it could easily have been discovered, and in one basic discovery, the whole of his Christian faith would have been falsified. And Paul makes that point very clearly. He said, look, if the dead do not rise, then we are all people most miserable, basically, or most stupid. Okay, slight different translation there, but basically that was his point. And so I find it interesting that in history there is a kind of falsifiability, and we have it the same today. You think of people who are Holocaust deniers, and that is so crazy, because you can talk to people who went through the Holocaust, they're still alive. You can go to Auschwitz, you can go to these places, to Belsen, you can see them. And so you can easily falsify those sort of claims when they're made within the lifetime of people who are still alive in particular. And the same is true in the first century. So, and I think often you can make parallels with the New Testament argumentation about evidence. And there was a lot of evidence for the resurrection, a lot of evidence presented there. And especially in the book of Acts, and then as you read the epistles of Paul and so forth. And you can make parallels, I think, with scientific thinking very clearly there. Just on that point, by the way, I often wonder why it is, certainly in this country, it's much easier to find Christians in academia who are scientists than there are humanities. I don't know what, it'd be interesting to know what it's like there in Canada, but if somebody asks me, can you introduce me to a few Christian academics in Cambridge? Well, maybe it's because I'm a scientist, but it's much easier finding scientists, I think, than in the humanities. And you can say, well, maybe in the humanities, it's simply, you're there to criticize a particular view. You're there to give both sides of the question, not to come to any conclusions. Because we scientists are really old-fashioned people. We believe in truth. We believe some things are the case and some things are not. So I think that's all wrapped up with this discussion about evidence. Anyway, I could go on about that, but I won't. There are other questions coming along.
That's great. Maybe David Clausen, I think you were next.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much for your intriguing lecture, Professor Alexander. And you talked about the academics who have come to faith in Christ. And I was wondering if they're having any impact, and how widespread, is there a revival of Christianity in the United Kingdom now? And if so, is it widespread, and does it go beyond?
Do you mind if I open the sound? Thanks.
Okay, yes. No, I don't think there's I don't think there's a revival of Christian faith in this country. I think that would be exaggerating a certain cultural move. I think there are what is striking is that there's quite a number, as I was mentioning during the talk, there are quite a few high-profile people who have publicly declared their sympathy at least for a kind of cultural Christianity. And I think, as I was saying, this is because they've recognized that having been brought up atheists or been an atheist or secular all their lives, they've sort of gradually dawned on them that it's really hard to maintain even democracy, even sort of fundamental Christian values of respect for the other person, for the academic freedom, or lots of different values really that certainly in this country you can easily look back and see how they come out of the Christian founding of the universities and so forth. And so I don't think that's a Christian revival, but I do think it's an interesting move, and who knows what might happen in the next decade or so. When you look at the history of Christian faith in this country, some people, of course, when you're often secular people think that somehow it's a one-way track, science goes up, religion goes down, and all this sort of thing. But to be honest, that really doesn't fit our history at all. And the greatest religious revivals in recent centuries in this country were the 19th century, when science was advancing in amazing ways, and where indeed the word scientist was invented by the master of Trinity College here in Cambridge in 1834. And then during the latter decades of the 19th century, people began to call themselves scientists the first time. It became professionalized. But it's actually at the same time, during that period, there were very major religious revivals going on in the 19th century. One could talk about the history a long time, but it's a fascinating story. So I think we had to be very, as we've seen the secularization of the West during the past decades, and there's no doubt that England is a very secular country, and there's no doubt that church going has declined over the past 50 years. But there's no particular reason to think why that should be a one-way arrow. It's very interesting to look at history, and that reminds us that history is never a one-way arrow.
Thank you.
I think it's also helpful to say with Charles Taylor that there are different forms of secularity. There is the normal immanent frame, which is open to the transcendent, and then there's the closed world system view, which is not open. Dawkins would obviously have a closed worldview to anything transcendent.
Yes, and to me anyway, I think in a sense, the rise of the new atheism was a clear demonstration that England is not, or Britain, the UK is not as secular as people had imagined. Because here were a lot of people getting very passionate about religion, although anti-religion, but very passionate about religion, and putting religious discussion right central into the media and into books, best-selling books, the 15, 20 years ago. And interestingly, I should mention, by the way, that we founded the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion here in Cambridge. I should mention it was founded it together with my colleague Bob White, who was professor of geophysics here at that time.
Beautiful.
That was in 2006. We started in January 2006. We didn't know about the God delusion. And so suddenly that came along, and it was a great gift for us, actually. Often people have said, if Richard Dawkins hadn't existed, we should have invented him. We would need to. There would have been a need to invent him in a sense, simply because of arousing public interest in this particular topic of science religion. And through his books and through the New Atheism, hundreds more people came to our lectures and to our courses than would have been the case otherwise. So although it had a negative impact in one sense, it also had a positive impact too in that way. And I've always felt, as I say, that it's a demonstration that this country is not as secular as people might think when you have these kinds of movements popping up.
Thank you. There's another question on the top left.
Professor Alexander, thank you very much for a superb outline of the book, which I hope many of us will buy. Just picking up on that theme of transcendence and secularism, if you think new atheism is on decline in the UK, perhaps not in Canada, but in the UK, do you think, in terms of kind of competition for minds and souls, that actually a greater threat potentially now is the impact of technology, particularly mobile technology, with its distractions and addictions in terms of just our neuroplasticity being taken over by addictive technology? Is that something which is a greater threat coming in now?
Thank you. Yes, I think that's a very valid point, actually. And just before moving to the main point there in the question, let me also highlight that if you do sociological analysis of the population, then those who self-identify as atheists has certainly increased. And I think it's continuing to increase in this country. It has increased over the past 10 years. I think one of the outputs of the new atheism has been the people who were sort of drifting along happily as secular people before, with no interest in religion at all. It's given them a language they can now self-identify, and they say, now I know, I shall call myself an atheist. And that's particularly true of young people, especially males between the age of 18 and 24. And if people have done sociological analysis, the traffic on the Richard Dawkins website, and the major population of people going to that website are in that category. They're late teenagers, early 20s. They're mostly male. It's a very male movement. And I think that gives us some hints about, so what's going on here about the need for people to self-identify. So that's possibly related to the main thrust of your question there about new technologies, especially the use of smartphones and so on. I think you're right. The populations are highly distracted. It's very difficult to get people to focus on, if you like, the more serious questions of life. They're always being distracted. In the 19th century, we had gin, okay, gin and tonic. Okay, so, gin was always thought to be by the upper class in the British Isles the way, the lower classes can now have gin to keep them happy, you see. And then, as we're on the subject of drink, that's how Guinness was actually created by the Guinness family as a philanthropic creation, because Guinness is good for you. It has very good nutritional value as created to replace gin. Well, you could say in the early 21st century in this country, mobiles are playing the same role of distracting and being addictive, and social media generally. So I think that does have there's a valid point there. It's difficult to generalize, though, isn't it, about all these things without statistical data. And the reason I say that is also because the media can be so powerfully used, as we've seen in people like Peter Barham and others, and many other people who become Christians, that media, especially online debates and all these sorts of things, can be greatly used to Christian faith. So I think it's a mixed story there, but I think there's a point there.
Good. I see another question. Yes, sir.
I think that's me. Thank you very much for the talk. Yes. I was wondering whether you have any views or comments on this general tendency, which seems to be present in many disciplines, of a decade-long popularity of some recycled view. It's usually a recycled view, and then that view being demolished by a passage of time, more serious study, and more serious reflection. Is this recycling really a marketing trick for talk shows and books? Is it, or maybe just boredom in general culture with the burdens of tradition? It seems we're so vulnerable to this recycling. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Thank you. Yes, it is interesting, I think. I think it's interesting that, I mean, atheism, after all, is an anti-movement, isn't it? The new atheism was very much an anti-movement, it was anti-religion, really was anti-Islam, although they never said that in public very much. But when you listen to Dawkins now, you can see how central that really was in his own thinking, still is actually. And I think anti-movements can quickly catch the media. The media loves opposite, loves conflict ideas, doesn't it? It thrives on conflict. And it's quite easy to write books about conflict if you hit the publishing market at the right moment. The same is very true of the media. We had up here
We can keep going.
We had the head of religious broadcasting from what we call Channel 4.
Then it's a long ride.
Okay.
I think you should stop and pee.
Okay. So I'll try and keep going. We had the head of religious.
Yeah.
We had the religious broadcasting to take part in a debate up here in Cambridge. He's the head of religious broadcasting for Channel 4, one of the main television stations here. And it was fascinating chatting with him afterwards, because it turned out that he had actually been the sponsor and the producer of a series of programs by Richard Dawkins back, and I think it was around the time the God Delusion came out. They were really drawing upon the God Delusion, and they had a big publicity and so on. And I was chatting with him, and we chatted about that, and he said, of course, we couldn't do that now. This was several years ago already, actually. He said, there's no way we could make a program like that now. It would just be dismissed as being silly, because he'd missed the cultural moment. And the same is true of publishing. And so, of course, when the God Delusion came out, there was a great wave of answer books to the God Delusion. They didn't sell as many, but you get a lot of answer books, and then you get counter books and all this kind of thing. So the publishers leap upon this very eagerly. They do well out of it for a few years, and then it quickly dies away. So these sort of cultural movements are very transient, I think. And you're right, they're gone. And you wouldn't be able to now publish a God Delusion today. Nobody would, everyone would think it was boring. Things moved on. There are different. If you want to write a book about transgender issues, then you probably sell quite a few copies. So the cultural movement and the cultural discussion, I think, is very quick to change. And I think you're right that these things get recycled. But I think the recycling has now just become faster, simply because of the ability to publish and to get on the internet and to use social media so quickly. These things can take off in weeks and they can die in weeks. Now it's amazing. I think that makes the task of the Christian, again, more difficult in some ways, but in other ways, then social media are powerful. They can be used in all kinds of different ways.
Good. I wonder if there's one other final question. All right, then. Well, thank you very much, everybody who's participated in this. Thank you for your questions and your dialogue. This has been a really great discussion, and I hope it continues beyond this session. And I hope all of you will read the book. It's a very readable book and very insightful from a variety of experts. And I found it a good book to read on the bus, for instance. And it really has made a contribution, I believe, in today's world. So thanks very much, Dennis and Alistair McGrath, for helping to make this happen. And thank you, Dennis, for your wonderful presentation today. I just have one final announcement, and that's our next presentation, which is with Dr. Jeremy Begbie, who has a connection with Cambridge as well as Duke University. He's in the area of theology and the arts. And his topic in January 30th, is C.S. Lewis and Unfulfilled Longing, an exploration through music. So perhaps in some ways, Jeremy will pick up the baton from today and move us forward in our discussion. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.